All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? As I said, my name is Christy Wolf. I'm the Vice President for Policy and Planning with the National Alliance. And today we're going to um, uh, provide with you context around an exciting resource that we've been able to develop in partnership with Bellwether Education Partners. Sarah, we can go ahead and move to the next slide. We're really excited to have with us today Lee Foley with Capitol Hill Partners, who has a broad range of experience across a lot of education and non-education issues. We also have with us Sarah Mead with Bellwether, and she will take the lead on the presentation today and was our close partner in putting together this content. We also have Renita Thurkal with the National Alliance. She's our Senior Advisor for Legal Affairs, along with myself. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So what we really wanted to do, we've already done a webinar that focused on the education components of the CARES Act when it passed about a month ago. But we had a lot of requests and interest in making sure that charters knew what was in the rest of the bill, as well as the earlier legislation that focused on providing immediate aid and relief and loan programs. And so what we've been able to do in partnership with Bellwether is put together a website that includes not just the education programs, but programs that are relevant to charter schools outside of the education focused programs. And so what we're going to do today is just provide an overview / reminder of the legislation that has passed and review the key provisions and programs and how that they are specifically relevant for charter schools. What we've been able to put on the website is it's what we know to the best of our knowledge at this point in time. So what we are going to do is continually, at least for the next period of time, update the document as we learn more about the competitions, resources that come out, programmatic requirements, all with an eye towards how this is going to work for charter schools. So this is going to be a very unique document, and we hope will serve our community well. Other folks are out there focusing on these issues, but not necessarily looking at them with the charter school lens. So we're going to dive right into that, but keep in mind that the slides today are just a sample of what's on our website. So the next slide gives you the web address where you can go to get the comprehensive information that we're giving you a sample of today. And at the end of the presentation, we are going to take time for questions. So feel free to put your questions in as we go along into the Q&A box. And given the number of folks on the line today, we will be just taking questions from the Q&A and asking the panelists at the end. So this will also be recorded, and really the content that you want is already on our website. We did our best to provide a sampling in these slides, but I think the slides, unlike other webinars, are of less interest to you all. So with that, I will turn it over to Sarah. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Christy. Can you all hear me okay? Great. So as Christy mentioned, in March, Congress passed 3 different pieces of legislation in response to the COVID-19 situation. The first of those pieces of legislation provided funding for vaccine development, research, and public health systems, and didn't really have much implication for K-12 education or for charter schools. The second piece of legislation, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, provided a significant infusion of funding for nutritional aid programs, including the school lunch program and the child and adult care food program, as well as some other food assistance programs, and also had provisions related to expanded paid leave and family and medical leave access that do have implications for most charter schools as employers that we'll talk about in a minute. And then at the end of March, Congress passed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act. That was a large response and stimulus package that included $2 trillion in emergency funding for individuals, businesses, and state and local governments, including dedicated education funding, some other funds that can be used to support education, and included some provisions related to educational waivers that we'll talk about in the course of this webinar. And it's important to also be aware that the second piece of legislation and the third piece of legislation, CARES and the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, do interact in a few ways around some of those leave provisions and some other provisions with implications for employers. So across those really two pieces of legislation that have implications for charters, there are sort of 5 different ways those provisions impact charter schools. First of all, as employers, charter schools that have fewer than 500 employees are impacted by the new sick, family, and medical leave requirements, as well as some other provisions related to them. Second, one of the unique and interesting things about the CARES Act is that a number of the economic relief provisions in it are deliberately designed to include nonprofits as well as small and mid-sized businesses in some cases. And so charter schools in many cases may be eligible to participate in some of those provisions that are designed to benefit nonprofits as part of a larger economic response. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the considerations there in a minute or two. Third, as schools, charter schools can benefit from both additional flexibility and funding that the CARES Act provides for elementary and secondary schools, as well as state education systems. Fourth, there are some other non-education funding streams that could provide potential funding sources for charters and other education and nonprofit organizations that are serving families and communities and children impacted by the public health situation. And finally, there are some provisions that can affect charter school employees, both teachers and potentially other staff, particularly if you employ folks who are participating in AmeriCorps. So I'm going to talk about these in order and pull in Renita and Lee to add as it makes sense. So first of all, new paid sick and expanded family and medical leave benefits. These were included in the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. They apply to all public employers and private employers with fewer than 500 employees, including charter schools that have fewer than 500 employees. Employers are required to provide up to 80 hours or 10 days of paid sick leave to employees who are unable to work for multiple reasons. I'm not going to go through all the reasons here, but they include both employees who are unable to work because of illness or quarantine related to COVID, as well as employees who are not able to work because they need to care for a child whose school or regular child care has been closed. What employees are entitled to differs a little bit in some of those cases, and you'll need to look into that, but it's important to be aware that there is a pretty expansive list of reasons somebody might qualify for this leave. The CARES Act does limit the amount that an employer can be required to pay employees for that leave. And some employers may be eligible for refundable tax credits to cover the costs of that new paid sick leave or expanded family leave. And the requirements are not permanent. They are in effect, they became effective April 1st, and they're effect through the end of this year currently. Rita, is there anything about the expanded family and medical leave, paid sick leave benefits you want to add?
Something about the employers who may be eligible. We might touch on this on the next slide. Those employers who are enrolled in their state pension plans are not eligible for the refundable tax credit at this time. It is possible that that may be modified at some point. And of course, as Sarah said earlier, as updates are made, we will be sure to update you. But at this time, for purposes of the CARES Act and the FFCRA, certain governmental employers, including those that are enrolled in their state pension plans, are not eligible to claim the tax credit, the payroll tax credit, or the employee retention tax credit.
Thanks, Renita. So, and on that note, we might go ahead and talk about some of the small business supports as well. So the CARES Act also provides for small business administration loans to provide economic assistance to employers. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the important features of these laws is that that economic assistance is not only available to for-profit businesses, but is also designed to be accessible to nonprofits and sole proprietors as well as small business. Now, these provisions have gotten a lot of public attention, and I do want to note that in part because of that attention, the Paycheck Protection Program is currently closed for new applications because essentially all the funding has been exhausted. There are negotiations going on in Congress to provide additional funding, which would allow additional entities to apply for those loans. But for now, if you have not already applied for or secured one of these loans, they're currently closed for new applications. But I'll talk briefly about what each of them are and then some of the other considerations to be aware of. So the Paycheck Protection Program is a program that offers small business administration loans to cover up to 2.5 months of operating expenses. It is available to nonprofit organizations. If the employee retains its employees, the loan can become forgivable, which would essentially turn it into a grant. 75% of it must be used for payroll costs, and the way that you obtain these loans is through a local bank, not by applying directly to the SBA. There are a number of specific eligibility requirements that applicants need to demonstrate that they are meeting or certify to, and some of them may not be things that apply to all charter schools. So charter schools need to exercise caution in thinking about this particular program. A second small business administration program that may be relevant to some folks is the Economic Disaster Loan Program. That covers immediate assistance to cover expenses that employers who are impacted by a disaster are facing. The important thing to understand is that borrowers can receive a $10,000 advance, basically as soon as they apply, that can eventually become a grant. This is a program that's administered directly through the Small Business Administration. Both of these programs, however, charter schools should exercise caution in thinking about. One thing just to be aware of is that with both programs, there have been some substantial implementation issues with both local banks and the Small Business Administration, where folks who are eligible for these funds have not been able to access them necessarily. Some of those may get addressed if there's a new congressional deal to provide more funding for the Paycheck Protection Program, but we don't yet have a clear answer what's going to happen there. The other set of issues, though, are around eligibility and some of the certifications that are required. That you must be a non-governmental entity to access these funds, and you also need to confirm that the uncertainty of current economic conditions makes the loan necessary to support ongoing operations, which may or may not be a provision that an individual charter school would meet. So applicants that are going to consider these provisions need to be sure they're able to document financial need and also need to seek board approval before pursuing these funds. And we would really advise that you speak to your attorney about your specific circumstances and applicable state and federal laws to determine whether these programs are applicable to you or not. Renita, anything you want to add there?
No, nothing to add. That was great, Sarah. Thanks.
Thanks. So we'll go on to talk about a couple other provisions in the legislation to assist employers and nonprofits that folks might also benefit from potentially. One, there are two other tax benefits for employers. One is the Employee Retention Tax Credit. This is for employers who do not participate in that Paycheck Protection Program. It allows those employers to claim a credit against employment taxes for wages paid to staff between March 12th and January of the current year and January 1st of 2021. The credit is worth 50% of wages up to $10,000 per employee. So essentially you could claim a credit of up to $5,000 per employee for that entire time period. And what you can claim the credit for varies based on the size of an employer. So an employer with 100 employees or less can claim that credit for any employee. An employer with over 100 employees can only claim the credit for employees who were paid but were unable to work or telework due to COVID-19. It is a refundable tax credit, and employers can request an advance in some circumstances. Again, as I mentioned, it cannot be combined with the Paycheck Protection Program. So if you've applied for that program, you cannot use this program. And as with that program, it's very important to talk to your attorney as well as also your accountant to understand if you're eligible and how you would actually go about using and pursuing this credit if you are, because there is some complexity around the refundability piece. In addition to that, employers may be able to defer their portion of Social Security taxes from March 27th through the end of the year if they are experiencing difficulties in paying them or in meeting payroll. If you take this option, you do have to pay the taxes eventually, but the payments are spread out so that they hit in 2 payments at the end of 2021 and then at the end of 2022. So it basically becomes a very long-term interest-free loan of those amounts of money if somebody pursues that. Renita, is there anything else about those tax benefits you would like to add before I talk about charitable contributions?
No, nothing further. Thanks, Sarah.
Great. And then in addition to those provisions, which are generally designed for employers but are available to nonprofits right now, there are some additional benefits specifically for nonprofits around charitable contributions and unemployment insurance. So typically, if you are a nonprofit employer that self-insures for unemployment insurance purposes, then you need to pay into the state unemployment insurance system when you have an employee who's claiming unemployment. This provision changes that so that the federal government will actually reimburse 50% of that cost for unemployment insurance for government and nonprofit employers who do self-insure for unemployment. So that's something important to be aware of if you are an employer who self-insures. And then there are changes to charitable contributions as well that could benefit nonprofits. So the legislation allows a $300 above the line charitable credit for individuals who don't itemize their taxes. So people even who don't itemize can take this credit against their 2020 taxes. And there are increases in the caps on charitable contributions for 2020 as well to encourage charitable giving in response to the needs that nonprofits are helping families and communities meet as a result of this crisis. So that covered sort of the employer and business provisions that affect charter schools potentially. I'm going to move on to talk about some of the education provisions. So the CARES Act provides additional flexibility for elementary and secondary schools, as well as for higher education institutions. We're not going to talk about the higher education waivers on this call, but there are some good resources out there that are linked in the document if you're interested in learning more about those. The Secretary of Education has been given authority to waive some accountability and financial requirements. States can get expedited waivers of assessment, accountability, and some financial requirements. All 50 states have now received assessment waivers from the Secretary of Education, and the department has released expedited forms for states to request additional financial flexibility. In addition to that, local education agencies, tribes, and states may request additional waivers of some provisions, including the poverty threshold for school-wide Title I programs, ESEA maintenance of effort requirements, carryovers of Title I funding, and some provisions related to the Title IV funds, need assessment, and provisions related to the use of them, including a cap on technology purchases. You would need to consider in your own situation whether these are flexibilities that you might find useful as a school. In terms of specific implications for charter schools, waivers that are granted to states or local education agencies apply to all public schools within the state or the local education agency's boundaries, including charter schools subject to state school law. And then second, charter schools that are LEAs may request waivers themselves the same way as any other LEA could if you think these provisions would be useful for you. I do want to note that in addition to these waivers, which are important but relatively narrow in scope, that the legislation does give the Secretary the ability to award, the legislation also requires the Secretary to report to Congress within 30 days on any other waivers that she believes may be required to enable schools or higher education institutions to serve students during the current public health emergency, with the idea that if there are additional rounds of legislation, authority for those waivers could potentially be incorporated in that legislation. We don't know if that is going to happen. We don't know what the Secretary is going to request. We don't know if it would be included in legislation were that legislation to pass. But I want people to be aware of that. And I think it's particularly important to understand that right now, the legislation does not provide any authority to waive provisions of IDEA or provisions other than those that we've listed in the documents we've shared with you. Christy, is there anything that you want to add to that, or do you want to talk about the CSP funding?
No, I don't think I'll add anything to the report. But just to mention that there is the possibility that certain states with expiring charter school program grant funds, so these would be funds that were awarded under the No Child Left Behind era of CSP grants. We've been made aware of a few states that have applied for flexibility in the use of those funds, some to make those funds available for a longer period of time for subgrants to open new charter schools. But another state has asked for those funds to be used in the immediate short term for technology needs within the state. We thought maybe we would have heard something from the U.S. Department of Education about the status of these waiver requests, but nothing has been determined yet. So I just wanted to make folks aware that that will be a possibility for in some states. So we will follow up with additional information once we hear what the status is of that flexibility, but just wanted to mention that.
Thanks, Christy. So I'll move on to talk about some of the funding that the CARES Act provides for education. So there was funding included for higher education as well as K-12 education, as well as for states in general. So there is a pool of funding, about $307 million, that the Secretary actually has discretion to award to states and local education agencies and institutions of higher education that are most impacted by coronavirus. That is not funding that you apply for. We have not seen any sort of detail on how that funding is going to be awarded yet. There's a second pool of funding that's $3 billion that goes to governors for what's called the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. Governors can use that funding to make grants to local education agencies that have been impacted but most severely by coronavirus, to higher education institutions in the state that have been most impacted by coronavirus, as well as to any other education-related entity in the state that the governor deems essential for ensuring continued delivery of education to students during this public health emergency. The application forms for that were released last week. Governors have them now. They can be submitting them. The Secretary is going to be releasing money quite quickly as soon as approved applications are received. Because governors are making that decisions about how to allocate those funds right now, this is something that charter school support organizations or charter schools themselves may be wanting to reach out to their governor's staff to make folks aware of needs that you're experiencing, ways you've been impacted by this, and also to help ensure that the funds are distributed equitably across sort of different schools that exist, including charter schools. Bellwether has produced a brief explainer on this that is included in the materials linked on the NAPCS website about this, and I would really encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested in learning more about this program. The second and the biggest pool of funding that's relevant to schools here is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. That is $13.5 billion. That will flow through formula to states, and then 90% of it to LEAs through the Title I formula. And we are expecting that the Department of Education should be putting out additional information around those funds this week and start releasing them to states and LEAs. The uses for which those funds can be used are quite broad, including pretty much any use under Title I of ESEA or under IDEA, as well as uses under the Perkins Act, under the Higher Education Act, and the McKinney-Vento provisions related to education, as well as other uses related to meeting the needs of low-income students with disabilities, English language learners, and other underserved students, providing continuity of delivery of education services, continuing to maintain the operations and employees of education systems. The uses are quite broad. One thing to be aware of here is that while the funds do flow to local education agencies, so charter schools that are their own local education agencies should expect to receive funds through this if they receive Title I funds currently. There are not in the legislation specific provisions sort of dictating how funds should be dedicated within LEAs. So one of the things that we are waiting to see is whether the Secretary will accompany with the release of those funds any guidance around ensuring that charter schools receive distributions of those funds out of the funds that go to local education agencies. So that's one thing to stay aware of. There is, in addition, a pool of funding for higher education institutions that that funding goes directly from the Department of Education to higher education institutions. And then finally, there is a program called Project Serve. This was a relatively small program that was created to enable the Department of Education to award relatively small grants to school districts or higher education institutions that had experienced traumatic events that disrupted learning, typically was awarded in the aftermath of school shootings and natural disasters. The CARES Act puts $100 million into that program that can be awarded to higher education institutions or local education agencies to help with costs related to cleaning and sanitizing facilities, providing social, emotional, and distance learning for students. And that funding it will probably not flow the way it typically flows out of the smaller program that previously existed, but we don't know exactly what that process will look like. And that's another thing that we will be keeping an eye on and updating on the website when we have more information. Christy, is there anything else that you want to add about those funding streams?
No,
Great.
Thanks.
So I'm going to move on and talk about a couple of funding streams that are outside of the Department of Education and not specifically for schools necessarily, but may also impact charter schools or provide funding that could be used to support education or meet the needs of students, families, and communities that you serve. First of all, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act did provide $8.8 billion in additional funding for child nutrition programs. Those funds are flowing, through state agencies responsible for child nutrition to the organizations that are delivering child nutrition services. There are a number of additional flexibilities that are provided as well that we'll talk about in a second that can help charter schools and other entities to meet the food needs of children and their families during this time. The Child Care and Development Block Grant is the federal funding stream that supports child care. There are $3.5 billion in funds that were appropriated for that program through the CARES Act to help sustain the operations of child care providers, help provide child care to essential workers, and help with the costs of cleaning and sanitation. Those funds go to states, which then are going to make decisions about how to use them to support child care. If you are a charter school that has a licensed child care facility that you operate, you may be eligible for some of this funding. It's something to track what's happening in your individual state. Head Start is a federal program that supports comprehensive early childhood development and learning for children in poverty. $750 million was provided through the CARES Act for Head Start. Those funds all go to Head Start grantees. So if you are a charter school that is also a Head Start grantee or possibly a delegate, you may be able to receive some funding through this program. Up to $500 million of those funds can be used to support supplemental summer programming for children who are going to be entering kindergarten in the fall and whose learning has been disrupted by the current public health emergency. And so there may also be opportunities for charter schools to explore partnering with local Head Start grantees around some of that supplemental summer programming. And then finally, I want to mention the Rural Utility Service Distance Learning, Telemedicine, and Broadband program. That is a program that makes awards to state and local government, tribes, nonprofits, and for-profit businesses to support access to distance learning and telemedicine in rural communities that are underserved. There is actually a competition that is open right now for $72 million in funds. So the $25 million that they received through CARES Act, as well as some other funds that had already been appropriated. That opened on April 14th and will close in, I believe, in June. And so if you are a charter school or an organization that serves rural communities and you are interested in seeking funding for broadband or distance learning, this may be a program that you want to look into. It is open now for the next competition. So I'm going to turn it over to Lee to talk a little bit about some of the programs operated by HUD, as well as the Community Services Block Grant Program.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to talk first about the Community Services Block Grant. The acronym is CSBG. Because that acronym is very close to CDBG, the next program I'm going to talk about, Community Development Block Grant, they're sometimes confused, but they are distinct block grant programs. In the CARES Act, the Community Services Block Grant got $1 billion additional dollars. That's more than 100% of its FY20 regular allocation. So these are additional dollars that the local grantees, which I will describe in a moment, will receive from the CARES Act. Very importantly, their base funding can only be used for serving families and individuals that are at 125% of poverty. This additional funding of $1 billion can be used to serve individuals and families up to 150% of poverty. So that's an important distinction. These funds go to local designated community action agencies. They are not always locally called community action agencies. Sometimes they're called community action programs. Sometimes they're called economic opportunity programs. You can locate your local community action agency by going to the Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families Office of Community Services to locate your local community action agency. While they are the recipients of the grant, their purpose is to develop anti-poverty strategies in their local communities, and they often use these core dollars to support other activities. So if you're not currently engaged with your community action agency, it may be worth contacting them. Also, apropos to one of the things that Sarah just mentioned, community action agencies are almost always a Head Start grantee as well. They are almost always the Low-Income Energy Assistance Programs, sometimes called LIHEAP grantees for helping low-income people with their energy costs. They are almost always a grantee for the Commodities Distribution Program, and sometimes are also a food bank for the USDA programs that got additional funding for food banks and commodities distribution under the CARES Act. So a good organization for you to reach out to. The Community Development Block Grant, it got $5 billion under the CARES Act, additional, again, more than 100% of its base funding. These funds flow down to states. Typically in the regular program, 30% is for the state and 70% is for so-called entitlement communities. Those are roughly speaking, larger communities, standard metropolitan statistical areas and larger. And the 30% that the governor receives is for the balance of state. These funds can be used for a wide variety of programs. Typically, the city and or the county, or both in many cases, receive an entitlement community allocation, and they will often fund their own housing and community development activities. But beyond that, they typically make grants to nonprofit organizations for a wide variety of housing, community development, and human services. So even though it's called a community development block grant, it often funds human services as well. The money, the additional $5 billion will come down in 3 different ways. One, there will be a $2 billion allocation under the regular formula. So the entitlement communities and the states will get their regular formula amounts. Then an additional $1 billion will come down to the governor for she or he to deal with important emerging problems, statewide issues, et cetera, with these dollars that are related to the epidemic and the economic crisis resulting from it. And then finally, there will be a $2 billion rolling amount that the Department of Housing and Urban Development will use to spend out to communities that are experiencing major increases in COVID-related impacts. So just thinking about where you are geographically, if you're in a large metro area that is a hot spot, you are going to get a disproportionate amount to the regular formula of these dollars. And so there may be opportunity to work with the city, the county, to get resources for your operations that are also impacted. If you're not in an entitlement community, then you want to go to the governor's office to get that kind of help. The Public Housing Operating Fund is another account within the Department of Housing and Urban Development, like the Community Development Block Grant. It is typically not something that might be of use to charter schools unless a charter school is in a public housing facility or immediately adjacent to it. These funds are basically for maintenance, operations, debt service, routine maintenance, upgrades, but Congress has provided $685 million additional dollars on top of the regular allocation and has given broad flexibility in how these funds can be used. So if you are engaged with your public housing authority, this might be a good time to talk to them about things that you think they could help with or you could help them with, because they do have this additional funding. There is a new coronavirus relief fund for state and local governments. This is designed to deal with the downturn in state and local revenues resulting from the economic crisis, to prop up those state and local budgets. So this is probably an important thing for you to refer to if you're talking to your state and local elected officials, that this money is to help them sustain their budgets, and things like the Education Stabilization Fund require a maintenance of effort. So it would not be prudent of them to reduce funding to schools in the face of the crisis, because they would potentially lose or be penalized in leveraging those other federal dollars. So dollars like these, the relief fund, can be used to support a maintenance of effort. And it is highly likely that this fund will be increased by approximately the same amount. It may not be in the bill that Congress is considering as an interim bill right now, but perhaps the one after that. And I think, Renita, you were going to talk about FEMA assistance.
Hi, thanks, Lee. Yes, I'll just quickly mention a couple things about the FEMA assistance. As you guys can see on the slide, there's been about $45 billion allocated to FEMA in FEMA monies, and those monies can be available to charter schools that qualify as local governments and or qualify as eligible private nonprofits. To be a private nonprofit under FEMA definitions, you have to have a C3 designation. It is an all-encompassing definition of private nonprofit, and if you have a C3, then you would qualify as a private nonprofit. Eligible private nonprofits, the word eligible references the use and maintenance of a public facility, and charter schools do in fact operate public facilities. So when applying for these monies, you go to your state FEMA office. Many state departments of education have information about how to access their state FEMA offices. When you try to apply, you have to indicate whether you are applying as a local government or an eligible private nonprofit. There is some inconsistency by state FEMA offices. Some are treating charters as local governments, others are treating them as private nonprofits. So we encourage you to check out how your FEMA office is handling this. There is also variance on deadlines. Each state is establishing its own deadline, and some deadlines are getting extended. So if you are interested in these monies, there are some open questions for you to consider. If you are applying as an eligible private nonprofit, often you cannot apply directly to the state FEMA office. You have to get approval to apply. So again, we encourage you to check out what the applicable process would be for your state, and also to get a sense of what your timeline would be. I would also be remiss if I did not point out that FEMA monies can often be challenging to get. The procurement process can be burdensome. And so it's worth familiarizing yourself with that process as you consider applying. And I should also say that the monies, as noted on the slide, can only be used for certain emergency protective measures for now, as those would apply most to charter schools, would be in the context of perhaps cleaning facilities. Since many facilities are closed for the time being and for the foreseeable future, you may want to consider how relevant those funds would be for you. There are also funds available for food costs, but as been discussed on this webinar, there are other ways that charters may be reimbursing their food costs. And in some states, they are encouraging all schools, all public schools, to document their expenses, as there may be an opening of the scope of uses for these FEMA funds, but for now, there's a somewhat narrow use of these funds.
Thanks, Renita. That was a good segue in terms of using funds for food. I did want to talk briefly about the USDA waivers for child nutrition programs. The second piece of legislation that we talked about earlier did provide the USDA substantial waiver authority, and the USDA has offered a lot of both nationwide and targeted waivers to help ensure that families that rely on schools to get food for their families, as well as some other child and family nutrition programs, are able to continue to access that food during this time. One of the most important is allowing families regardless to pick up meals to take home without children present, waiving requirements for congregate meal feeding or for educational activities to accompany after school meals and snacks, waiving mealtime requirements, waiving some requirements related to nutritional content. Some states have also taken advantage of flexibility to provide families whose children participate in school lunch programs with something that's basically the equivalent of a EBT card that they can use to purchase meals at grocery stores and other places for their children. The USDA website has extensive information and Q&As about all these flexibilities, but we would urge folks who are participating in those child nutrition programs and working to feed families in their communities to look into those flexibilities and make sure you're aware of them and using them. Finally, I do want to note that there are some student loan and AmeriCorps provisions that may affect charter school staff. One of the particularly important provisions of the CARES Act is that it suspends payment interest for federal student loans through September 30th of 2020. There are some additional implications for some teachers because teachers who have loans may be participating in either teacher loan forgiveness programs or more general student loan forgiveness programs. So under the legislation, months of suspended payment should be counted as if the borrower had made a payment for the purposes of student loan forgiveness programs. The Secretary of Education is able to excuse a portion of service obligations for teach grants, and part-time or interrupted teaching can count towards those obligations if you have teachers who are on teach grants. For teachers who are participating in teacher loan forgiveness, the legislation waives the requirement that years of teaching be consecutive if folks' service is disrupted by this crisis. In addition, teachers who took out loans for graduate or alternative coursework that they were taking right now that's been disrupted by COVID may have the opportunity to have those loans forgiven. And finally, AmeriCorps, if folks are currently participating in the AmeriCorps program, and I know some charter schools do employ AmeriCorps volunteers, folks may have their service disrupted or they may have their service change. Folks either who are the employers of those folks or the volunteers themselves should look to the Corporation for National and Community Service, which has extensive FAQs and information on their website to help people navigate what this may mean for their individual situations. So I think we've covered a lot of ground and have about 10 minutes left. So I will open it up for questions and discussion.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So just as a reminder, there is a little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen in which you can use to enter questions. We've had a few come in, but not that many. But let's just get started with the ones we have. We have one question about whether or not extended bereavement leave is covered. And I'm not sure, I guess this would be for the emergency family leave question. Renita or Lee, any thoughts about extended bereavement leave?
I don't know the answer to that, Christy. We'll have to check that out.
Okay.
I don't either.
Okay. We will look into that. We have a question about technology needs. So there was not any technology specific funding stream in this bill, but the funds that schools receive as part of the fiscal stabilization funds could certainly be used for technology. We do anticipate that there will be some specific technology funding in the bill that is likely to come up after this measure that's being considered right now in Congress to provide additional funding for the SBA loan program. Sarah, anything to add to that?
No, I think that's right. And remember that the uses of funds for the elementary and secondary school stabilization fund and the governor's emergency education relief fund are quite broad and include funding streams that can be used for technology, and that the waivers that LEAs can request include waivers for caps on technology purchases with Title IV-A funds. So those are two options. And then also, if you are serving students in rural areas, the rural utility service funds can be used for hardware and infrastructure costs related to technology as well. So if you are in a rural area or serving rural students, that is something you may want to look into.
Thanks. All right, so we have another question about FEMA and whether or not it would cover transportation costs.
Hi, this is Renita. I think you would need to go and take a look at how your state is defining emergency protective measures and how the transportation might factor into that. There are some very specific uses for these funds, so I couldn't offer a general answer about transportation, but most state emergency offices have information about this on their websites. I'm sorry, that's not an easy yes or no answer for me.
Thanks, Renita. So we have a few questions. I'm going to try to answer a couple of them at once about the stabilization funds and when they're going out and how they're going out. we anticipate that the department will be announcing the funds for the states to apply for them by next Monday, so hopefully this week, along with an FAQ of questions for how states should consider the distribution of those funds. And there's another question about whether they're going to be based on Title I shares from FY20 or FY19. So in terms of federal funding, the FY19 funding is what states have for this current year. So it went out, states get allocations in July and October. So whatever a school got this year for this 1920 school year is what's supposed to be used to determine those proportional allocations. And let's see, we have a PPP question. If we get a PPP application in through our local bank, but we have not heard any response, is there still any hope? That sounds like an existential question. Renita or Lee, any hope? What do you think?
Well, so SBA has been under pressure from Congress to develop a queue for applications that had been reviewed and approved by banks and that banks tried to upload after the funds for the guarantee expired. They have not developed a queue yet. That does not mean that your bank can't hold on to that application. Congress is going to replenish the program. It's likely going to be a very significant replenishment. It will likely not require a new, different application than the program under the previous funding, but banks can decide to change things on their own because this is a bank lending program. But I would, if you haven't heard, reach out to your lender now, indicate to them that you hadn't heard anything, ask about it. If they indicate that they attempted to upload and could not, that probably means they tried to do it after the 15th, which is about when 15th and 16th is about when the last applications were successfully uploaded. But that doesn't mean they can't try and upload it after the Congress replenishes the funds.
Thanks, Lee. We have a question here. Can you elaborate on states that reduce education funding and the resulting effect to the coronavirus relief funding?
I'm sorry, this is on the state and local coronavirus relief funds?
I'm assuming so, yes.
Okay, can you try one more time, Christy?
Yeah, it says, can you elaborate on states that reduce education funding and the resulting effect to coronavirus relief funding? Maybe it's more general. I thought that was about the coronavirus fund, but maybe not.
So I did mention that there is a maintenance of effort requirement in the Education Stabilization Fund. And so it would be imprudent of local and state officials to reduce funding for schools when you can get more federal money if you don't. So there is that sort of tangential relationship between those two accounts. States and localities can use the coronavirus relief fund, $150 billion, with more coming, to prop up their budgets due to lost revenues. And they should be prudent about that. They should use it to prop up accounts that if you were to reduce them, you would lose other federal money. It would not be wise to do that. You should encourage them to be very careful about how they use that coronavirus relief fund to state and local governments.
Thanks, Lee. We have a few questions about future funding. What's the likelihood of additional funding? The status of all of that. And I think the short answer is that we anticipate that there will be more funding. What it will look like, we're not sure. I think we've already mentioned the tech. There's probably more stabilization fund coming. There's interest in funding for IDEA. Sarah, Lee, any other thoughts of what other pots of funding might be coming down the pike? School construction in terms of stimulus is a possibility.
Yeah, I think that last point you made, Christy, is we're likely to see 3 tranches of funding, and 2 of them could be combined into one bill. So we're going to see what Congress is referring to as the 3.5 bill, the interim bill, possibly this week. That will replenish PPP and also the EIDL that Sarah talked about earlier. That's agreed upon in general already by the White House and both sides of the Hill. The devil is always in the detail, but those things will be in there. There'll be additional hospital funding, and then question marks about anything else in that bill. Beyond that, there'll be additional emergency relief funding, because a lot of things that a lot of policymakers agree upon won't be in this interim measure that are emergency relief. And then there will likely be an economic recovery measure that could be combined with additional emergency relief, or it could be a separate, what would become a 5th bill then. And some of the things that Christy just mentioned could be in either emergency relief or economic recovery, or some part in each one of those features of one bill or 2 different bills.
I think Lee makes a point that came up in what he just said now, and also across his earlier comments about the Coronavirus Relief Fund, that is important to keep in mind, which is that there are sort of 2 important ways to think about the funding that intersects with education. One is in terms of specific education funding or funding for education that charter schools and other schools or school districts may be able to have access to, both to help with the increased costs related to coronavirus and for other purposes around that. But then there's a separate issue, which is that the economic impacts of what's happening right now are going to have impacts on state and local budgets that without some kind of intervention will flow down into all state governments fund, including potentially education. And so funds like the Coronavirus Relief Fund that are designed to help with that, sort of solving that state and local budget problem and filling the gap, may not be directly called education funds and how they flow out, but they have important implications for what the state funding picture that sustains the bulk of the revenues that a lot of schools get looks like going forward. And so keeping an eye on sort of both of those things at the same time is going to be important in terms of what the future legislation and funding that come along could look like.
Thanks. Well, we're almost out of time. I just want to, there have been a number of PPP questions coming in, and I think a number of them can be answered by referring to the materials that we have collected on the website that we're highlighting as part of this webinar. The actual web address is at the beginning of the slide deck. So please refer to those with some of those specific questions. And maybe we'll close out with a real fun maintenance of effort question about, let's see if we can merge some of these. Someone's asking about the maintenance effort requirements that are attached to the stabilization funds, and whether we anticipate that states will request waivers to that. Well, maybe I'll just leave it at that and see what you have to say, Sarah. Lee.
Lee, do you want to say anything about that?
Sure, I'll take a first crack at it, and then you can correct everything that I say that's wrong, Sarah. So the Secretary does have waiver authority with respect to the maintenance of effort requirements of the stabilization fund. The non-federal entities, state and local government, have to maintain their effort, that is their funding, based on a 3-year average running up to this year. So whatever that 3-year average is, they have to maintain that level in return for receiving in FY20 this year, this current year, and next year, in return for receiving their share of these stabilization funds. Again, the secretary does have waiver authority if there are extraordinary impacts. I don't think we've seen anything from her yet as to how she's going to, referee that waiver authority, but she does have that authority.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing. So yeah.
Great. All right, well, we're over time and our attendees are dropping. We will try to follow up on some of these questions in some way. Like I said, this is the first time we've used Zoom. If you have questions that you would like to follow up on, you can reach us at info@publiccharters.org. And thank you so much to our panelists today, Sarah, Lee, Renita. Thank you so much for being a part of answering these questions. And please let us know if there's more we can do. Folks want another webinar on all these topics. Dangerous offer. But thanks everyone for being a part of this. And we look forward to serving you in the future. Have a great day.
Thank you.